All right, let's talk about the trait of high sensitivity. Is it some kind of superpower, a flaw, or is it something else entirely? Today, we're going to dive into the science behind what it actually means to have a highly sensitive brain.
Does this sound familiar to you? That feeling like the world's volume knob is just turned up way too high? You know, getting easily frazzled by things that, well, most other people don't even seem to notice.
And this isn't just, a personal preference. It can show up from a really, really young age. This quote here from researcher Sarah Kay On is just so telling. She's describing her own experience with her highly sensitive child, where even something as simple as a meal could turn into a total sensory overload. Now, if this is all starting to feel a little too personal, you are definitely not alone. Not by a long shot. Multiple studies show this trait of high sensitivity is found in about 20 to 30% of the population. That's roughly 1 in every 4 or 5 people you know. It's a really significant and pretty common part of who we are as humans.
Okay, so if it's this common, what exactly are we talking about when we use the word sensitivity? Well, the science actually has a very specific term and a definition for it.
The official term is sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS for short, and researchers basically boil it down to a few key things. First, there's a greater depth of processing. This means sensitive people just tend to think more deeply about, well, everything. They also have lower sensory thresholds, so it takes less noise, less light, less of anything to stimulate them. And finally, higher emotional reactivity. They just feel things more intensely, both the good and the bad. Now hold on, a really common mix-up here is confusing SPS with introversion. They are not the same thing. SPS is all about how your brain processes input from the world. Introversion, on the other hand, is about where you get your social energy from. In fact, pioneering researchers in this field found that you can absolutely be a highly sensitive extrovert. It's not about being shy, it's literally about how your brain is wired. So that's the big question, right? If it's all about the wiring, what does that wiring actually look like? What's physically different inside a highly sensitive brain? Okay, to get into this, we have to touch on a concept called neural entropy. Just think of it as a way to measure how complex and rich your brain activity is. A brain with high neural entropy is kind of like a super high fidelity microphone. It's just picking up way more detail, more nuance, more informational richness from the world. And here is where it gets absolutely fascinating. A 2023 study using EEGs to measure brain waves found that people who scored high for sensitivity also had significantly higher neural entropy, even when they were doing nothing, just resting. Their brains are, quite literally, processing more complex information all the time. So all this constant, deep processing has some pretty profound effects, especially on something like our memory. But as another recent study shows us, it's a real double-edged sword. The environment, the context you're in, it changes absolutely everything. So how does this actually work? Check out this experiment. The setup was beautifully simple. Researchers had people memorize a list of words. Then they split the group. Half of them got to just rest quietly for 8 minutes. The other half had to do a mentally demanding, distracting task. Then a whole week later, surprise, everyone got a pop quiz to see how many words they could remember.
The results were pretty wild. For the group that got to rest quietly, the people with higher sensitivity actually remembered more words a week later. In that calm, supportive environment, their brain's deeper processing actually helped lock those memories in more effectively.
But here's the other side of that coin. For the group that did the distracting task, the people with higher sensitivity remembered fewer words. In an overwhelming or distracting environment, that exact same deep processing brain actually became a liability. And this chart just lays it all out perfectly. Look at this. For people with low sensitivity, the environment, rest versus distraction, it didn't really make a huge difference. But for the highly sensitive people, the effect was massive. The right environment boosted their memory way up, and the wrong one sent it crashing down. Okay, so that's the lab, but how does all of this translate to our actual daily lives? Let's talk about what it's really like to live with this trait. The challenges, but just as important, the ways people learn to cope. The qualitative research paints a really clear picture of the challenges. Because the world often isn't a calm, quiet place, highly sensitive people can be more prone to things like anxiety and depression. They might feel isolated or develop lower self-esteem from just feeling different and constantly being overstimulated. But here's the thing about people. We adapt. And the research also shows that highly sensitive individuals develop this amazing toolkit of coping skills. Things like becoming super self-aware, making sure to schedule mandatory downtime to recharge, actively controlling their environment when they can, and using relaxation techniques. These all become essential life skills.
So, it all comes back to this one core idea, this theme of for better and for worse. High sensitivity isn't inherently good or bad. Its outcome seems to depend almost entirely on the environment.
You know, the researchers who did that memory study, they put it perfectly. They concluded that people don't just differ in how sensitive they are to bad environments, but to good ones too.
So here it is, the big takeaway. The most important thing to remember is this. Sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's not a bud. It's better to think of it as an amplifier. It dials up the negative impact of a stressful, chaotic world, sure, but it also dials up the positive impact of a supportive, calm, and enriching one. And that leaves us with a really big question for all of us. Knowing that almost a third of the people around us have this amplifier built right into their nervous system, how do we get better at designing our world? How can we create spaces at school, at work, at home that don't just minimize the bad, but actually maximize the good and allow every single type of brain to truly thrive?